World leaders have voiced disappointment at the lack of progress made on climate policies at the G20.
It's the body that should be leading COVID recovery, economic recovery, but it's also hopelessly divided between its internal membership.
And that, to me, makes it a disappointing G20.
Despite its early promise, the G20 has often been criticized for failing to tackle some of the most pressing global issues of our time. But how and why did the bloc come into existence? What challenges has it faced? And are the criticisms really warranted?
The G20, or Group of 20, is an informal meeting of 20 of the world's largest economies. It was born out of the G7, or Group of 7, in 1999, with one main purpose: global financial stability. At the time, the world was in the process of recovering from a financial crisis, which originated in Asia in 1997 and spread across international stock markets. The finance ministers and central bank governors for the G7 met in Washington, D.C. following the crisis and realized they couldn't sufficiently address vulnerabilities in the global financial system without expanding the number of economies sitting around the table. So they proposed a new forum, which would eventually include the G7 countries and 13 other systemically significant economies.
The forum was initially confined to the finance ministers and central bank governors of the 20 members. Guest countries, as well as international and regional organizations, would also be invited to attend. But heads of state didn't get involved until nearly a decade later, when another bigger financial crisis came along.
The G20 leaders meeting was a result of an accident. The big accident was the global financial crisis of 2008-2009.
Kishore Mahbubani was the president of the United Nations Security Council in the early 2000s. He explained to me how the G20 meetings expanded in scope.
The United States realized that it was in its interests to have a leaders meeting to try and find a solution to the global financial crisis. And I would say that was the finest moment of the G20 leaders meeting, especially the second leaders meeting in London. They came up with a global stimulus package that essentially saved the world. And it saved the world because everybody participated in it. Even China, which had not been very badly affected, was prepared to commit $50 billion for a $1 trillion global stimulus package.
Collectively, the G20 bloc makes up over 80% of global gross domestic product and 75% of international trade.
The G7 is a sunset organization and the G20 is a sunrise organization. When the G7 leaders meet, they claim to speak on behalf of the world, but they represent less than 10% of the world's population, whereas the G20 represents 60% of the world's population.
While the G20 may indeed be a more representative body than the G7, it doesn't mean impactful solutions like the global stimulus package that emerged out of the 2009 summit come easily. In fact, much of the heavy lifting is done in the lead-up to these meetings.
The G20 presidency rotates each year among its members. In the absence of a permanent secretariat, a troika, which consists of the current, previous and incoming presidencies, shapes the agenda while ensuring the continuity of tasks and goals from previous years. This work is divided into two streams, a finance track and the Sherpa track. All agenda items under the finance track are handled by the members' finance ministers and central bank governors.